Welcome to Pandemic Ponderings. Hello, I'm Rick Jordan. The story of Joseph takes up the last third of the Old Testament book of Genesis. Even though we hear more about Adam and Eve and Abraham and Sarah and Moses and Aaron and the Exodus, our ancient forefathers and foremothers of the faith must have thought that this story was important, given all the ink that Joseph gets. For those of us raised in the church, we easily recall the stories. Joseph was a favored son, one that his father gave a magnificent robe. The older brothers were jealous, not just of the robe, but of the favoritism that Joseph received. Eventually, Joseph grew up to become a key leader in Egypt, able to save his father and brothers from starvation because of a severe famine. Of course, there's a lot that happens between Joseph's robe and Joseph's role in royalty. There are many ups and downs. We hear mostly about the downs, about the crises in Joseph's life. As they say in the news business, if it bleeds, it leads. Joseph's story makes me ponder about the will of God. These bad things that happened in Joseph's life, were they God's will? Did God orchestrate all of it? Was God behind the story, knowing what was going to happen because God was controlling it all along? Joseph is introduced to us as a boy who has some dreams. Sheaves of wheat are being bound by Joseph and his brothers, when suddenly Joseph's sheaf stands upright and his brothers bow to that sheaf in reverence and adoration. And then Joseph has another dream of the sun and the moon and 11 stars who bow down to Joseph. It hardly takes a Sigmund Freud or Carl Jung to figure out those dreams. Were the dreams from God? The Bible doesn't say one way or the other. The narrator is clear that they caused Joseph's brothers to hate him, not only for their father's favoritism, but for having these dreams and for strutting about as he told them about these dreams. What they wanted more than anything was to be socially distanced from this little brat of a brother. Eventually, the brothers capture Joseph and put him in a dry well to die. But then they take him out to sell him as a slave to some traveling merchants. They take his coat and dip it in blood. When they get back home, they give the coat to the father to let him draw his own conclusion, which he does. He assumes that his favorite son was slaughtered by a wild animal. Sometimes I hear people talk about God's will, and it seems as if the timing of events happened just perfectly, it must have been God's doing. Everything fell into place, so it must have been God's will. But I wonder if Joseph's brothers felt that way. Everything fell into place. They got rid of a problem and made some money to boot. Or I wonder if Joseph felt that this was God's will, that he be betrayed and abused and enslaved. There are other situations in Joseph's narrative that bring up the same question. Was it God's will that Joseph become Potiphar's slave and then be falsely accused of seducing Potiphar's wife? which led him to go to prison, which led him to interpret more dreams, which led him to the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, which led him to be put in charge of Egypt's agriculture, which led him to save the Egyptians and his own family from starvation. How much of that was God's doing? How much was Joseph's? How much was just luck? There's even more to the story, of course, because it is a lot of the book of Genesis. But when Joseph finally does reveal himself to his brothers, who have not recognized him when they come to Egypt, Joseph reveals himself as the missing brother, but he won't allow them to take any blame. From Genesis chapter 45. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" His brothers could not answer him because they were dumbfounded before him. Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be upset and do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For these past 2 years there's been a famine in the land, and for 5 more years there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to preserve you on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it is not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me an advisor to Pharaoh, lord over all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." It's clear that Joseph believes that God was at work the whole time. If we look at this passage, again, I've highlighted here in red, God sent me, God sent me. It was not you who sent me here, but God. How in control is God? Could God have stopped the pandemic that we are living through now? Did God cause the pandemic? It's something to ponder. When crises happen, many of us turn our thoughts and prayers heavenward. We trust that God cares. We hope that God will act in some way that will help us. These ideas that God is in love and that God has the power to change things are often in tension. The question of God's will is not easy to sort out. If God cared for Joseph, why did God allow all those bad things to happen to him? If God had the power to change the brothers' hearts or to change the plans of the merchants, the way they would journey, why didn't God change those things? I'm coming to believe that there are multiple things going on around us and through us. There is God's will. There is the will of evil. There is people's will, an individual's will. There are natural laws, and there is happenstance or luck. So it is a little arrogant for me to dogmatically declare that a particular event is God's will. Joseph seems convinced that this whole plan was God's doing. I would beg to differ. Yes, ultimately things worked out well for Joseph and the Egyptians and his family. However, years later, because Joseph had invited his family to Egypt, and because they stayed where he had found land for them to stay, and they prospered and grew in number and in wealth, then when a Pharaoh came along who did not know Joseph, he had Joseph's descendants enslaved. Was that God's will? I'm not smart enough to know. I'll keep pondering, and I invite you to ponder as well. Thanks for joining today. I hope you'll join me next week.